Let's now turn to Professor Stephen Osborn, Professor of Governance and Chair of International Public Management and Director of the Center for Service Excellence in Edinburgh University, United Kingdom. Steve?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to the JB and Dr. Salah for inviting myself and my colleagues to come and talk with you about our experience. I think it's up to you to decide if the ideas and insights we have are of use to you or not, but we'll leave those discussions to yourself. I work at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, where I direct the Centre for Service Excellence. And this is a centre that works with service organisations in both the private sector and public sector, so we cover both areas. And at the moment, our main focus is upon, on the one hand, public service organisations, and on the other, banking and finance. So we put together those years. I worked myself as a service manager for 15 years in local government in the UK prior to moving into a university post. And a lot of my work focuses upon the links between public services, government bodies, and citizens. Now, Vision 2030 has a lot to say about governance, and governance is one of those words which incorporates many aspects. It talks about the internal transparency and functioning of organizations, the external transparency and audit, the facilitation of inter-organizational relationships, relationships between public services, government and citizens, and the role of negotiated service delivery in providing public services. And I want to talk primarily about the last part and then link it at the end to some of the governance issues. But I want to do that a bit like Jerry did by taking some of the key elements of Vision 2030 and just considering what I think some of the governance challenges are. So it starts out by saying that Saudi Arabia is a pioneering and successful global model of excellence, and that's to be applauded. You'll gather from my own centre, I'm very keen on the idea of excellence. It incorporates both a qualitative element of performance as well as a more quantitative one. Talks about living by Islamic values. I think values are fundamental to governance, and I'll come back to those later on. But again, I'm delighted to see values in it. And it talks about effective, transparent, accountable, enabling, and high-performing government. And that's the bit I want to unpackage, really, in terms of a few sections of the document. So there are 5 challenges I want to pull out. The only ones in there, but 5. First off, the document talks about the need to deepen participation and deepen communication channels to listen to citizens. And I think that's really important, the idea of communication between government, public service providers, and citizens. Because I think one of the problems that many public management reforms over the past 20 or 30 years have had is they've tried to understand public services as if they were products, as if they're manufactured goods. And that hasn't been very helpful in helping us reform public services, because the logic and nature of managing and governing services is quite different from the logic and business management of manufacturing goods. That's not just true for public services, it's true for private sector services as well. They are quite different. They're always co-produced. We talk a lot about building citizens into public services, but you can't have a public service without some co-production between the citizens, the service users, and the organizations providing them. So they are co-produced. They thrive on user-led innovation. In services, and this is all services, something like 2/3 of innovation in services comes from consumer user-led innovation. Essential driver of innovation in service delivery. So effective public service governance is more than just listening. That's a great starting point. But it's also about putting citizens at the heart of public service delivery. If you don't do that, you aren't taking public services seriously as services. We have to remember that if you're working in a private service, you'll talk about a service promise that you're offering. Public policy is a public service promise, but it needs citizens and the expectations, the experiences of citizens to make those promises a reality. So listening is a great, great starting point. But to really get to the heart of Vision 2030, you need to move beyond listening to putting your citizens at the heart of public policy and public service delivery. Secondly, Vision 2030 talks about promoting collaboration and integration between health and social services. And this is really important. All too often, public services around the world treat citizens, people, as if they have a set of different needs that different organizations should deal with. But we all know that issues of social and health are very, very interlinked, that people's well-being at a social and at a health level are interlinked. So I'm absolutely behind Vision 2030 in wanting to link up health and social services. I would say, though, that effective governance here doesn't just rely on the effective structures. There's a lot of talk about structures in the vision. And of course, structures are important, but structures by themselves are not enough. What you need to pay attention to is the internal governance of the organizations and the working cultures of the staff inside those organizations, bringing different cultures together. If you're bringing health and social care together, for example, you have doctors, you have physiotherapists, you have social workers, you maybe have teachers or police. They all have different organizational beliefs and cultures. You need to work hard at bringing these together, not just getting the structures in place. And that needs to go hand in hand with the role of citizens, again, as co-designing and co-producing these services. Don't just focus inside organizations, look at the links between those organizations and the citizens who you're serving through public services. Challenge 3, again from Vision 2030, to create a supportive and cooperative environment in which the non-profit sector's institutions can flourish, and to deepen regulations necessary to empower non-profit organizations. I guess I have a few reservations here, if I'm honest. And I think you're absolutely right that a flourishing non-profit sector requires a supportive framework from government to give it space to flourish and to contribute both to delivering effective public services, but also to contributing to civic life and to the achievement of the Islamic values which are so core to Vision 2030. And of course, regulation is essential against corruption with this sector as it is with any sector of society. But, and I think it's a big but, government cannot create or empower sectors, and particularly a non-profit or a civic sector. It has to be independent. It can't simply be something created and governed by government. There needs to be, we would say in the UK, some clear water between government on the one side and the non-profit sector on the other. Because if you just create, and again from the document, institutionalized and formalized non-profit organizations, that's not an independent sector. That's unaccountable government. And that's not what you want. So do think carefully about not over-regulating, over-prescribing, over-governing the sector. Create a space, create boundaries, but allow the sector to develop independently as well. Not just a challenge for you, it's a challenge my own country and other countries around the world struggle with. This balance between creating a space for the non-profit sector, but allowing it independence to flourish. And also, I would say bear, and it's a particularly American phrase, but it's one which I think has resonance around the world, beware of for-profits in disguise. That is businesses, business corporations, which use a non-profit format to gain tax advantages, but actually are not about creating an independent or civic voice. They're just about creating additional wealth for their shareholders. Nothing wrong with doing that, but not when you're manipulating legislation to create advantages against other organizations. Fourthly, prepare public services for the benefits of privatization and competition. I'll have to be honest with you, for me, and I think the evidence speaks for this manifestly around the world, actually, sector is unimportant. The private sector really is no better or no worse than the public sector. They're both quite different. They both have distinctive strengths. They both have distinctive weaknesses, as does the third sector. What is really, really important for the effective governance of public services is diversity, is that you have private sector organizations, public sector organizations, non-profit organizations, all providing public services, all bringing their distinctive capabilities. But please don't be seduced by the idea that simply having a private sector firm producing a public service will make it better. It may do, it may not, but by itself it won't. It will be the governance structures that allow public, private, and non-profit to work together. That's what will make the difference. Private firms have strengths, diversity, they lever in resources. They have drawbacks. The private sector is corrupt. It lacks a public service ethos. Those two things are true of some private sector organizations, not true of others. Don't think sector is the most important thing. It's diversity and bringing together the strengths of the different sectors, which is important. Likewise, competition can have real strengths. It can reduce unit costs of services. It can increase the throughput of individuals through services. But it also has high transaction costs. The costs of putting services out to tender, the costs of monitoring and evaluating those tenders are very expensive. Most of the research I've seen around competition tends to suggest that the reduction in unit costs are more or less matched by the increases in transaction costs. So there may be good reasons for using competition as a governance mechanism, but it's not about reducing money or efficiency necessarily. It's about focus, and it's about bringing organizations in. And also, certainly in the service sector, most of the research, and again, this is about services in general, private and public sector services, most of the research argues that open collaborative innovation is much more successful in terms of developing and improving services than competitive innovation. Finally, in terms of the challenges, improve government by eliminating redundant roles, strengthening processes, defining responsibilities, and continuously restructuring. Now, certainly in Europe and the West, this is often done under the name of lean reform. Lean was a technology developed primarily in Japan, and in the private sector, it's had great successes in enhancing the performance of private sector companies. In the public sector, on the other hand, and this is research around the world by colleagues over 20 years, lean has been spectacularly unsuccessful in producing any real benefits to public services. And there's a very, very simple reason for that. Because when lean, when this restructuring, when this stripping out of organizational processes has happened in the private sector, the focus has always been on creating external value for their customers. How do we improve our internal processes to create external value? Lean in the public sector has been about how do we reduce organizational costs? How internally do we make ourselves very efficient? The result has been very efficient public organizations which continue to fail. They fail very efficiently, but they continue to fail. So by all means, pursue a route of restructuring to reduce redundant roles, to strengthen processes, but do it with a focus on the external value you're added, not just on internal efficiencies. I would also caution against continuous restructuring. As I said, I spent 15 years working as a public service manager in the UK. And the first response of any public service organisation or of government to a change would be to restructure. The problem with restructuring is it consumes huge amounts of organisational energy, resources, both human and financial, which could be directed to enhancing performance. Sometimes restructuring is very important, but do not think you should be continuously restructuring. I think that is a worrying trend, if I'm honest. It consumes an awful lot of energy that sometimes can be better used to just making things as they are better. To conclude, just some key principles. Focus. I think the key element of good governance for public services is to focus on value added to citizens and to society. Externally focused value added, not internally focused. Remember when you talk about that value is an objective term. It's a social term. What's valuable to you is determined by your values, your Islamic values. You have to understand the values that underpin your services to understand the value that you want to add to citizens and to your society. Secondly, and this again comes from the wealth of research and practice in private sector services, value isn't added or created by service or public service organizations. Value is created by the consumers and users of services and public services. The phrase they use in the private sector is that it's value in use. A service, a public service, only has a value when it's used by its citizens and it adds value to them. It has no value otherwise. So again, focus upon that value in use for your citizens. Thirdly, a lot of governance, particularly external governance, is about negotiation. Negotiation between public service organizations, between the government and service providers, between citizens and these providers. And negotiating people, persuading people. It's not enough, and we make this mistake over and over again in the West, I think. It's not enough to be right. It's not enough to say, but our policy is right. You have to persuade people that it's the right thing, and that's citizens and service providers. Fourthly, focus audit, and coming back to your own particular concerns, upon the outcomes and the impact that you want to have, how you want to change people, change society for the better, not just on activities and outputs. A lot of the problems, and I agree entirely with everything Steve said about the importance of performance management, but one of the problems, I think, particularly in the UK we've had, is we focus on performance management, which is about how busy people are. What activities are they doing? That doesn't tell you very much about the impact they're having. And certainly in Scotland, with Audit Scotland, we've been developing a performance outcome system to try and support these relationships. And finally, when you're doing this, create a regulatory framework which privileges open governance, which privileges open relationships. The benefits of diversity are the way different parts of society can collaborate together to achieve the tremendous vision you have in this document. So look, please, for collaboration, not just for competition, because collaboration is real strength. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I think there is a theme here in the presentations, and that is that there are many complications involved in fulfilling Saudi Vision 2030, were that to be fully attempted. And then it is also possible to draw the wrong implications or very uncertain implications from the ideas that have been understandably put forward in the document. And that it's possible, of course, that one could set out to implement those ideas and would find oneself engaging in a great deal of trial and error learning. And I think some of the advice or some of the ideas that you've heard today are sort of meant to do better than simply suggest you go down a course of trial and error learning. I think there's an emphasis in the presentations on the fact that that there's a tendency to idealize the functions and mechanisms of governance in documents like Strategic Vision Saudi Vision 2030. But a mechanism that works is not the same thing as a mechanism that is idealized in any document of that nature. So that, I think, is a common point for us all.